Some of you already tried to sneak in some suggestions without group consent. I'm kidding. Are there any that you're like, I absolutely want to see? I want to take a look at this one in particular. Do you have any ones that rise to the top? We're basically going to workshop the process of text criticism. 1 Samuel 17 has gotten a vote. Does anyone have any others that might rise? Also, I want to say 1 Samuel 15, 50 to 51, as Eliana pointed out, does not exist. I meant to type 1 Samuel 17 because I am, as I said earlier, the weak link in this whole process, right? We, the interpreters. Anyway, so, yeah.
Mark 9, 16, 9 to 20.
Great. That one, huh?
John 7,
53. Great. Okay. I'm gonna triage these in order of importance. There's one that I didn't include on this that I thought, I wasn't sure if you guys would be curious to see it, is in Psalm 22, I think it's verse 16, is the text where it says, they pierced my hands and my feet. And there's a big difference between the Masoretic text and the English text that we have in that one. So we could look at that one as well if we have time. Does anyone want to see that one? You don't care? Okay. Okay. So we're going to do those in order. So we're going to start in 1 Samuel 17 and we're going to look around. So turn there in your Bibles, 1 Samuel 17 verse 50. And again, if you have a study Bible, they will probably point out some of these things as we go along. I think I've mentioned this at least in small group as we've been going through it. 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings are some of the books of the Old Testament that suffer the most from what we would call textual corruption. And most of that is like how long a king reigned for. And those are very hard things to backfill. But in 1 Samuel 17, at least, is one that I would say is doctrinally significant. 1 Samuel 17 in verse 50. Does anyone want to read that? 1 Samuel 17, 50 and 51.
Is it 15 or 17?
Sorry, am I saying 15 right now?
17.
Yes, 17. I had a typo in the thing. Yeah. Does anyone want to read that, verse 50 and 51?
I got it.
Great.
So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled.
Great. Now, can someone go to 2 Samuel 21, verse 19?
Got it.
Great.
Says, there was a war with the Philistines again at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jair Origin, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam.
Okay. You see the problem? Question is, who killed Goliath? Okay. I don't think it's possible for this to be a different Goliath, like there was one Philistine named Goliath and then another one, because both texts point out that his shaft was like the spear of a weaver's beam. Or his spear was like the shaft of a weaver's beam. So I think the text is explicitly identifying this Goliath as the same Goliath from 1 Samuel. And so I don't think it's possible for us to say just two different Philistines named Goliath who were killed by two different Israelites. So here's the way the modern textual scholar interpretation of this goes. Well, of course, David didn't kill Goliath. David is like King Arthur. He's a fictional character. He's a conglomeration of many Israelite kings. He's hyperbolized. He's deified. And so, this is probably the person who actually killed Goliath. And then later, a story about David being the one who kills Goliath is helpful to serve the narrative of David being this typified king in Israel's history. But these sloppy Masoretes, they just left this other story in here, and they just didn't cover their tracks well enough. But the authors of 1 and 2 Chronicles, or the chronicler, when he comes and he writes about this, he actually adjusts this text in 2 Samuel to once again affirm that it was not David it's David who killed Goliath, and in fact in 2 Chronicles what it says is that it's Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath, is the way the chronicler records this. So that actually the chronicler says 2 Samuel is where the textual corruption happens. So we're going to workshop this a little bit. So this is actually a fairly easy text to resolve because we have this long account in 1 Samuel 17, and we have the author of Chronicles who writes this a much later account, who agrees with the 1 Samuel 17 identification that it's David who kills Goliath, and this other person, Elhanan, he killed the brother of Goliath. Okay, and so we're going to reconcile those. I want to show you briefly how those work. For most textual criticism, a good study Bible will help you all the way through it. But it does help to know some original language stuff, because that is actually where most of the debate happens. Now, in Hebrew, the Hebrew letters, some of the letters look the same. And so actually the first difference about whether it's Goliath who was killed or this man killed the brother of Goliath, the textual difference between this text and the text in Chronicles that talks about it, is actually one small Hebrew letter called a yod. So it's either he killed Goliath with what's called a direct object marker. It's either an et, which just simply marks Goliath as the direct object of the sentence. So-and-so killed Goliath. Or if it's the brother of Goliath, all that's needed is for this letter to be misread as a chet, and for there to be a yod in the text. And a yod is so small that it looks on ancient manuscripts like a smudge or an ink stain or something like that. They're often missed. And so you can easily say that this text reads the brother of Goliath like it's recorded in Chronicles to say, and in Chronicles this is the part of the Hebrew text that is preserved. So you can see it's literally one small letter. It's the bottom part of a letter and a letter inserted here. And that's where you get two massively different readings, whether it's Goliath or the brother of Goliath. Now, as to the name of the person, if you were asking the question, well, who is this person? It says, at least in the text of 2 Samuel, it says that's Elhanan, the son of Jer-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, who struck down Goliath. Well, actually, if you go look at the text of 2 Chronicles that reconciles this, they identify this Elhanan as killing the brother of Goliath, and the brother of Goliath's name is Lechem. And the way you get those two different readings is Bethlehemite and this direct object marker. There's only one letter difference between them, and then you have a space and Lechem or Bethlehemite. So the first part of Bethlehemite is simply the direct object marker plus a letter in Hebrew. So it's actually just basically one letter missing in each case that leads you to basically two vastly different readings. So when we're talking about a difference of meaning, did David kill Goliath, or was David a fictional character? Well, what would reason tell you? This text has been copied for 2,000 years. If you miss a letter here and a letter there, and then in Chronicles it affirms the earlier reading and it corrects some of these misnomers, well, that's actually easy to reconcile. And actually, if you have a Hebrew Bible, they'll have what's called a marginal reading, where in the margin they say, here's what the Westminster Leningrad Codex says. That's what's preserved in the actual text. And in the marginal reading they say, but we suggest what's called a different reading, where they would insert a letter to make sense of the text, so that the text has no disruptions between them. So in this case, that's how you would reconcile. So yes, David killed Goliath, and this other man, Elhanan, killed the brother of Goliath, whose name was Lachmi, the brother of Goliath. And if you just read 2 Chronicles, it says exactly that. And so the two texts are not actually wildly different like they are in English. It's two Hebrew letters that are missing. And that's the difference. That make sense? Question?
I'm just curious why the English translation is.
Great question. The Septuagint agrees with Chronicles. The reason that our English Bible says this is because our English Bibles are, for the most part, based on the Westminster Leningrad Codex, which is this Hebrew Bible. And so they preserve the readings of the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is where this discrepancy happens. And so there are other suggested readings from this, like I said, the Septuagint, or from other texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Masoretic text itself doesn't have either of these readings in the body of the text itself. So, yeah. Our English Bibles will often do this, by the way, where sometimes they go with the Masoretic text and sometimes they go with the Septuagint. And in this case, if you have a King James Bible, a King James version, they actually go with the Septuagint's reading of this text instead of the modern NIV does as well, I think. So, anyway. So, okay, that's the first one. I think Mark 16, 9 through 20 was the other one that you guys wanted to take a look at. So go there to Mark's, what's called the longer ending of Mark. Okay, Mark 16. I'm going to read a couple of verses beginning in verse 7. So the women show up to the tomb. They go and they tell the men. The men go to the tomb. I'll pick up in verse 5. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's probably where Mark's gospel ends. And if you have, my ESV has like a bracketed section that says some of the earliest manuscripts do not include, and they include verse 19 to 20. If you were to pull out a Greek New Testament, these changes are not unfamiliar with those Greek texts as well. So if you were to go to the end of Mark's gospel, Mark chapter 16, it'll have the same kind of thing. And you don't need to read Greek to be able to see this, but you'll see the same bracketing happening. So I don't know if you guys can see this or not, but those same brackets, double brackets, occur in the Greek text at verse 9 and then end at the end of verse 20. If you want to take a closer look at that, you can take a look at this. But the point is, people have known this for a long time, that this ending is probably not original to Mark. And so one text critical principle that we have is called going with what's called the harder reading of a certain text. Meaning, if there are two different editions of the text, and the earlier edition of the text is shortened and more difficult, and then the later version of the text is longer and kind of smoothed out, well then we would preserve the earlier and more difficult reading. The reason is because if you're a scribe, you're copying something down and something seems to not jive quite well, you're going to probably try to smooth it over. You'd be inclined to do that. If you were a scribe copying Mark's gospel, you would not be inclined to cut off the gospel at verse 8. Because verse 8 ends Mark's gospel with the apostles not hearing, right? The women go, they're told by the angels to go, and what does it say? They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's where it probably ends. There's a reason Mark probably does this. I'm not going to get into all of the theology behind this, but the point is, if Mark's gospel ends here, and not with a longer ending, you don't actually have any loss of meaning. Because all of the other synoptics basically say the same thing. The women were afraid at first, they flee for a time, and then they go and tell the other apostles. And in Mark's gospel, this motif of fear and trembling and amazement is actually quite common throughout the gospel. And so Mark's writing to his audience, and some people are receiving this gospel for the first time, and he ends his gospel account basically saying, here are the women hearing the news of the resurrection, afraid and amazed. Now what do you do with it? And it has kind of a rhetorical effect for the reader as they're reading and they go, what do I do with this message now that I've heard about Jesus resurrected? Do I go and tell? Do I obey what the angel has said? Or do I not say anything to anyone? So it has a rhetorical effect. My point is, even if you don't know Greek, and even if you don't have access to a critical edition of the Greek New Testament, most English Bibles will point out this difference, bracket it off, and explain to you why it is that we might not include Mark's longer ending as original to Mark. The earliest manuscripts that we have in the papyri do not ever include the longer ending. It only shows up in later editions of the gospel. So that's the long ending of Mark. You guys have further questions on that? You see at least part of what's going on? This is called going with the harder reading. If a reading is more difficult to make sense of, that's probably the original reading. Because scribes don't tend to introduce confusion into the text. They try to smooth the text over time. That's the human tendency.
So my study Bible says some of the earliest manuscripts.
Mm-hmm.
So are you saying that those manuscripts that included verses 9 through 20 were
later?
They were early, but they were still later than the original.
They would date to like the 5th and 6th century, as opposed to like the early 2nd century. Yeah. Early, in terms of a manuscript, refers to probably anything within the first 200 years. A late manuscript would be like 8th century onward. So the longer ending of Mark shows up in some early like 4th century, 5th century manuscripts, but it doesn't show up widely in many manuscripts. In the stream called the Textus Receptus, you don't need to know that term. It's what the King James Bible is based off of. Those manuscripts are widespread. They're all over the Middle Ages in the European world. And they all preserve the longer ending reading, which is likely why in our English Bibles we keep this reading at least in the text, even though the earliest manuscripts don't contain this reading. And there's other examples of this as well. So, that's a good question. Okay, that's the longer ending of Mark. Let's do, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to footnote all the discussion on John and say, if you look at that John text, the woman caught in adultery, you'll have all of the same things that I just said. The woman caught in adultery story does not occur in any of the early manuscripts of John's Gospel, and in the manuscripts where it does occur, it floats around. So sometimes it occurs where it does in our English Bibles, sometimes it occurs in Luke's Gospel, sometimes it occurs in chapter 21 of John's Gospel. The point is it's flying all over the place, and the reason is because the scribes are trying to figure out where this probably true story about what Jesus did should be inserted into these books. But again, it's not original to John, meaning when John wrote his autograph, he probably didn't include it, which is why it floats around. What all that means is the woman caught in adultery story is probably something that truly did happen. It's probably really relaying historical details, and it's not part of John's gospel. And that's fine. John, at the end of his gospel, does he not say, there are many more things that could be written about the things which Jesus did, but these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So John is telling us a redacted story about Jesus, a focus story. And so, of course, there's going to be other true stories about Jesus that do not violate Scripture. It's totally consistent with the character of Jesus. There's no doctrine threatened whether you include it or exclude it, because if you exclude it, you still have in Luke's Gospel Jesus dealing with a woman who's caught in prostitution and who goes and anoints his head with oil. And even in John's Gospel, you have the woman at the well, who's a woman who's disgraced by her many husbands, disgraced by her sexual promiscuity, and sent by Jesus to go preach the gospel. So you don't lose any theology, any doctrine, any character, anything at all by losing this text from John's gospel. And it's probably still true. So, okay, I'll footnote that all there. Psalm 22 is really fascinating. This is, if you're ever dealing with a Jewish person and you're trying to say, Psalm 22 points to Jesus being crucified on the cross. Here is a verse that I think is actually really difficult. So, Psalm 22, if you want to turn there in an English Bible, almost all of our English Bibles on Psalm 22 will disagree with the Masoretic text and follow a reading from the Septuagint. So what does Psalm 22 verse 16 say for you? If someone wants to read it. Yep.
For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet.
Okay. Now, if pierced my hands and feet sounds like crucifixion. The Masoretic text does not say they have pierced my hands and feet. In fact, even in my ESV, my copy of the ESV is like a bare bones kind of copy, which means it doesn't have a bunch of marginal notes and stuff. And even in my very redacted copy of the ESV, it has a footnote on this verse. And then in that footnote, if you follow it down to the bottom of the page, it says, some Hebrew manuscripts, like the Septuagint, the Vulgate, the Syriac, agree with this reading. Most Hebrew manuscripts, like a lion, my hands and my feet. And some of you might have that same footnote. Some of you, like a lion, my hands and feet, would be preserved in the text. That would be very rare, actually. Okay, this one is actually easier than that earlier text in 1 Samuel 17 that I showed to you. Let me show you the difference between like a lion, my hands and feet, and they have pierced my hands and feet. So there's a Hebrew letter called a kaf, and then you have a tet, and then you have a resh. Sorry, this is a resh. So I know you guys can't see this, but it's 3 Hebrew letters is called the root of it. And then the difference between that last letter, sorry, let me adjust this here. This is not a chet, that was from earlier. This is an aleph. So it's either ka-ri, which is what the Masoretic text preserves, which is like a lion, my hands and feet, or something that's not attested to in the Masoretic text, but it's attested to in other Hebrew texts, is karu. They have pierced my hands and feet. So the difference between those two vastly different English readings is the difference between what's called a yod, that short letter we saw earlier, and what's called a vav, which is just a yod with a longer tail on it. That's the difference between those two. So how do we know which one's original? If all of the original Masoretic text readings have that yod and not the vav, why would we have a reason to insert that? We have the agenda of proving Christ was crucified, so we insert it. No. The Jews, hundreds of years before the time of Christ, in the Septuagint, translated this text in the Septuagint to say, they have pierced my hands and feet. In Greek, you cannot mistake it. There's no textual debate. Septuagint translates this verse 200 years before the time of Christ as, they have pierced my hands and feet. They preserve this reading, not the Masoretic text reading. We have other Hebrew texts that preserve this reading, not the Masoretic text reading. And frankly, the Masoretic text reading makes no sense. Like a lion, my hands and feet is not a sentence. And even in Hebrew, which is it flips nouns and verbs a lot, it's not a sentence in Hebrew either. You need a verb there, and they have pierced is a verb. So that's the difference there. You can see how one small change can result in massively different English changes. Okay, the point of that is what I would call a load-bearing difference. In the New Testament, when it talks about Christ's crucifixion, is Psalm 22 quoting and talking about the crucifixion or not? That's theologically significant. The Masoretic text says no. The Septuagint and other Hebrew witnesses say yes. And the difference is simply one long vertical line. And again, it's very easy to mistake this letter for the vav. That's the difference between those two readings. And so I think most English Bibles do follow the Septuagint reading and the other Hebrew manuscript readings, and for good reason. It makes sense of the text, and yes, I think it points to Christ. So, okay. Those are the four we've introduced. If there are others you want to look at, I think we are maybe close to out of time for this section. Are there any others that you're just like, you really want to see, or maybe you really want to see it, but we could talk about it privately instead of in a group session? Okay. If there's no more examples, let me just conclude. Okay. Okay. If there's no more examples, I'm going to answer questions in a second. Let me just conclude with two different points of application that I think these will both be pretty brief. What I'm trying to show you in all of these case study examples is that all of these many differences that, all these variants in the Bible that exist, 99.8% of them bear no difference at all on the meaning of the text. It's a fraction of a percent that bear meaning on the actual text itself. And we've looked at all the ones that have quasi-meaning differences, where it's a large section of the text, or it's a significant verb, or talking about crucifixion or not. And of the ones that have meaning differences, it's actually fairly easy to resolve what's going on. There's other examples I've listed for you here. I'm not trying to hide these manuscripts, these variants from you. Your English Bibles aren't trying to hide them from you. All Christian scholars know these exist and have good answers for all of them. The church fathers knew these variants existed and had answers for all of them. And so all I'm saying to you is, when we talk about the textual criticism of the Bible and the inerrancy of the Bible, even though we don't have the autographs, we can still see behind, with all these variants, what the text originally was very likely. Because of all these variants, they actually help preserve to us the meaning of the text. They preserve to us what the text actually said. The second thing is more of a particular application. And this is something that if you have friends or family or others who are Muslim, all these variants is like a core apologetic difference between Islam and Christianity. Now, if you're talking to a Muslim, you actually don't need to prove any of the things that I just said. All of these variants and all of these early readings and all of this stuff, is there oral tradition transmission, is all of this stuff, we don't need to prove any of that. Because when Muhammad records the Quran, when he records his recitations, in the Quran he says, the Jews and the Christians have the scriptures. The message I give to them, they should read from their own scriptures, weighing my message against their scriptures. Muhammad is writing in the 5th, 6th century, sometime around there. Okay, well, he's not writing, he's reciting, and others are writing his stuff down. The point is, Muhammad says, the Bible is reliable, the Old Testament is reliable. Go to it and test my message against it. And if all our standard of textual stability has to go to the 6th century, we have full manuscripts by that time, like hundreds of them. Not hundreds of them, we have dozens of them. So if you're dealing with a Muslim and not like an atheist or an agnostic, well, for a Muslim, you don't even need to go to any of these details. We have full copies of manuscripts that all agree with each other by the time of the 5th century, which is when Muhammad is writing and saying, the Bible is reliable, go look at it. So Those are just 2 points of application for you. And I would say textual criticism is a very contextual thing. Depends on the person. It depends on the weight of the text. So there's lots of variance in this practice. But I want you to know, just with a little taste of it, that the Bible is reliable, and I've just tried to give you some examples of that. So, okay. I'll pause and take questions now. Sean, you had a...
Is there a reason that they wouldn't take a step back, for instance, in the Psalm 22, when like a lion by hands and feet? Is there a reason after translating that they wouldn't take a step back and be like, this doesn't make any sense? What's the goal, or what's the reason?
This is difficult. There's probably 2 reasons, and I think both are equally likely. In the Westminster Leningrad Codex, which is what the Hebrew Old Testament is based off of, they have known mistakes in the text, and the Masoretes know those mistakes exist. And in the margins, they say, here's other variants or revocalizations that make sense of the text. But they value the Word of God so much that they say, but what we're not going to do is change the text. So they say, this reading doesn't make sense, and I think I can make sense of it in my commentary on the side, but what I'm not going to go do is insert changes into the text. The Masoretic text is preserved remarkably over the course of 1,000 years. And by the way, this is one of the reasons Hebrew is the way it is. I just showed the consonantal system. When they come by later, the Masoretes have to introduce vowels into the text to preserve the meaning and the readings. They don't even want to insert vowels in between the letters. So they put the vowels around the letters because they don't want to mess with the text. So they insert the vowels around the consonants as opposed to splicing vowels into the consonants. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is a little bit more nefarious, which is that at various points, Psalm 110, Psalm 22, and other points that seem to be messianic and dealing with Christ, that there is intentional redaction of the text. The criticism often goes the other way. The Septuagint is the Christian Bible, and in the Septuagint they translated it like Parthenos, virgin, to refer to the birth of Jesus, even though in the Hebrew Bible it doesn't have to mean that. Well, you could cut that the other way. The Septuagint is older than the Masoretic text. We have a copy going back to the 4th century AD. The Masoretic text, we have it in the 10th century AD. The Masoretic text could have been altered as well by Jews who rejected Christ as their Savior and said, okay, and there's some of these things that are prophecies, and maybe we'll just cover this up. That's also a possibility why you might have some of those differences. And so the Masoretic text is one stream going back to the autographs. The Septuagint is another stream. The Dead Sea Scrolls is another stream. And all of them, I think, help us get to the actual thing that is behind all of them, the original text. So...